Reginald had worked at the Archivum for 35 years. He had read every Munitorum manual of arms, even though he wasn't technically supposed to. So when his trusty Mark IV chain axe's machine spirit went on the fritz, and Brunt's armory served up a Mark XII in replacement, well, he knew exactly what to do with it. Reginald here. So there's new patterns of weapons in Darktide, and most notably there is a new chain axe, the Mark XII, which is available for both the Veteran and the Zealot. So is it any good? How do you use the thing? What are its attacks for? And how should you build it? We're going to cover all of that in this fairly fast guide. I think I found a way to make these a little quicker than I have in the past. Now I have to come clean with you at the start of this video. That thumbnail is not accurate to my actual attitudes about the Mark XII, but it was funny, and I did kind of make it in response to some conversations I had with Claesthetics, and so I kind of had to keep it. I will say I am disappointed that they gave us this chain axe and not the two-handed chain axe, but maybe one day we'll finally get my desired weapon, and I'll turn out to not like it as much as I like the Mark IV, or something like that. So we'll see. In any case, the role of the Orestes Mark XII chain axe in your kit is that of a specialist and elite sniping tool. On screen is a nearly perfect Mark XII chain axe. I might actually take a little bit more mobility and lose a little on defenses here, but on the whole, this one's almost ideal. Just as with the Mark IV, the modifiers that you need to make sure this weapon does the damage it needs to do is damage, penetration, and shredder. You can dump on mobility and defenses, but don't dump too hard on either of them. As for this weapon, just like the Mark IV, mobility controls your sprint speed, dodge distance, and dodge limit, while defenses controls your sprint cost and push cost, both of which are important. Though, on the Mark XII, the push attack cost is a little less important since it's a much more single target focused attack, and you could probably dump here rather than losing out on that mobility stat. One of the other downsides of the weapon I've chosen to show you here is the unarmored damage perk. It's not unideal, it actually gets you over an easier breakpoint on Dreg Gunners, and that's pretty nice, and also Dreg Shotgunners, but it isn't as good as taking Maniacs, which can make it much easier to kill Muties and Dreg Ragers, which are pretty key targets and probably more important than Shotgunners and Gunners. Carapace at 25%, however, in my opinion, is completely required for the build that I will be showing you today, and I'm going to explain why. With 25% Carapace and Thrust, you can get a one tap on every Crusher you see. Pretty nice. So with perks out of the way, we're going to talk Blessings. The Blessing pool, much like on the Mark IV, is very viable. You can pretty much use whatever you want, including Bloodthirsty if you really wanted to, and I think that's really nice on this weapon. However, I'm going to make a strong recommendation that you pick up Thrust. Thrust benefits on the Mark IV very little. It's only good for your heavy Rev Attacks. It doesn't really benefit your swinging Horde clear attacks all that much. But on the Mark XII, you're going to be using those heavy overheads without Rev to try and snipe some elites. And you can get some really nice breakpoints for one-tapping things with your normal heavy attacks without having to rev anything up, which is safer and easier than doing a big thrust Rev attack. Likewise, it benefits your heavy Rev attacks, so you can get some really spicy one-taps on some very big targets, doing a ton of damage to key enemies. For this reason, Thrust is a multi-benefit type of blessing on the Mark XII that it just isn't anywhere else. And since I tend to try and stay in melee as much as possible, on my Zealot anyway, and on my Veteran, I want a weapon that's going to be useful defensively, I'm going to recommend Slaughterer or Headtaker. I think Slaughterer is actually better on the Mark XII because you need a little extra damage on the light attacks to make them feel good, especially on the Veteran. I think Headtaker is okay. It's fine on the light attacks, but when you're doing heavy attacks, you're using Thrust, which slows you down, and so you're not going to be building Headtaker all that fast when fighting elites anyway, which is usually where you want Headtaker instead of Slaughterer. Since you're not going to be using it to that advantage, I think Slaughterer is better. It lasts a little longer, so if you are fighting into a Horde and then you go to kill an elite, you'll probably still have those stacks. This makes the weapon more consistent overall and makes it nicer for, with the extra cleave, dealing with Horde enemies. I think Rev It Up is actually a good choice. If you're running Zealot and Thrust, it can actually make the weapon really fun to move around with a Swift Certainty build type thing, which I will link below. It's kind of a joke build, but it turned out to be really good in Karnak Twins for its various mobility advantages. So, I don't know. You're welcome to try it, but don't take it too seriously. Bloodletter did not get me over any interesting breakpoints that I wasn't getting out of Thrust. And in fact, I kind of felt like if I was going to run Bloodletter on the Mark XII, I should just take the Mark IV instead. Bloodthirsty also just didn't really impress. I Yes, you can get some breakpoints from it, but it only benefits your special attack, specifically your second special attack after getting a kill. And if you want to ensure that kill, you're going to have to use thrust, and then you can already one-tap whatever you just killed, and you can get a slaughterer stack instead if you want it. And so I don't really see value here, since I'm always going to one-tap unless I'm trying to reduce how much thrust stacks I need. It just didn't seem like there was any added value. I couldn't find value in Thunderous. That doesn't mean I'm right. Maybe there's something I'm missing. However, my experience with the weapon is that the light attacks only add 1 stack of brittleness, unlike the light attacks on the Mark IV. And while the special attack will add 4 or 5 stacks of brittleness while it's doing it, we've just discussed how with thrust you can always get a kill, a one-tap, so why bother stacking brittleness when you're going to concretely kill whatever it is you just hit? And then with the heavy attacks, you'll probably be picking your target better and using the Rev instead if it's too big to be killed with heavy attacks. So I just am not seeing value out of Thunderous on this weapon. I'm not saying it's bad. Again, I think you could use anything in here and still get value out of it. But the best blessings to me are Thrust, Slaughterer, Head Taker, and Rev It Up. The other 3 blessings that I've described are just not really all that worth it, but if you get stuck with them, don't feel that bad. They're certainly not awful. Let's talk about the weapon's attack patterns. The Mark 12 is largely a very straightforward weapon with only 2 of each type of attack. Very simple stuff. The light attacks have 2 alternating X pattern swings that have the exact same stats for each swing. They are relentless, which means they're more focused on stagger than they are on damage, but they do perfectly adequate damage and they come out quickly. They're great for horde management. The heavy attacks are 2 identically statted overhead attacks with latching behavior that lasts for 2 ticks, so very similar to how it works with the light attacks on the Orestes Mark IV and the very otherwise familiar heavy attacks on the heavy chainsword variants. Or so I thought anyway, until I nailed a crit and realized it's actually 4 highly compressed ticks of damage. And what this does mean is that while you can dodge out of these heavy attacks just like you can with the Mark IV without incurring any stamina cost, you may see a bit more variable damage. With the Mark IV, you can dodge out of the first tick of damage and not get the second. But with this, you could dodge out of the second tick of damage, the third tick of damage, or just before the 4th tick of damage at any time. And since they're so compressed, you're never going to be able to really reliably make sure that you're getting just 1 tick or another. Not that that's an especially big deal. You're going to dodge out when you need to dodge out, not just for fun. But it might result in a little bit more shifty breakpoints if you find yourself having to dodge out. The push attack on the Mark 12 is a thrust, an actual stab, using the, I think, spike, though you can do a Rev Attack with it too, for the same number of ticks on the Rev Attack as you would get out of a light Rev Attack on the Mark 12 or either type of Rev Attack on the Mark 4. That is to say, it does 4 ticks of damage. Who knows how it does that, because it certainly doesn't look like it can. The Rev Attacks on the Mark 12 are a little different than they are on the Mark 4 or other chain weapons. Notably, this batch of chain weapons that came out with the most recent patch in 15.2 came with longer rev times. The light attack rev is going to only do 4 ticks of damage, and the thrust as well, but the heavy attack rev does 5 ticks of damage, which means it's going to take you longer to get to the end of it, but it does more damage at the end and across its duration as well. This means it is a pretty heavy hitting attack. Alright, well, we have talked about the attacks and how they are used, what they're generally for. Let's get specific. What are the key breakpoints we want to care about? This is where I think I can save us some time. Rather than going through it piece by piece with every enemy, like I've done in other videos, I have created a table of all of the key breakpoints that you might care about. And, interestingly enough, you should be able to hit these breakpoints with either the Veteran or the Zealot, assuming a typical build. In fact, when testing these, I used the same builds I used in my Mark IV video, and I will link those below. And then for specificity's sake in this table, what I've tried to do is provide the minimum required application of buffs, whatever those are. Those are all listed on the right hand side. I'm using thrust as a blessing, and then I'm targeting headshot, and it's for either class. So I've tried to specify here in the notes on the far right exactly what the minimum requirement is in order to get that one tap. So like Maniacs, for example, Drag Berserkers and Scab Berserkers are really hard to get, but the other ones are actually fairly easy. Like Scab Shotgunners, you just need like 1 stack of thrust cold with no other blessings and buffs of any kind, and you can just tap them out. So let's just walk through that. As you can see, you can get on Drag Berserkers, Scab Shotgunners, Drag Shotgunners, Scab Gunners, and Drag Gunners. That is to say, all the human-sized elites except Maulers, a 1-tap heavy attack, no rev, just the single heavy attack with thrust 4 and something, right? Pretty nice. For Reapers and Bulwarks, you're going to need a heavy rev. You are going to also be able to get a 2-tap just heavy attack with full thrust stacks. So that's pretty cool. That can be handy if you're looking to kill those quickly. Maulers, you do need 25% carapace, and that's in part because you're really very likely to hit the head with these attacks. They're direct overheads. It's hard to hit the shoulder. It's very likely to hit an arm. So in general, I find that smacking maulers in the head with 25% carapace will kill them. Crushers require just a little something from the talent pool, but you only need 3 stacks of thrust, 25% carapace, and like something, right? And that'll get you over the line. You can't just go in completely cold. Mutants, you can actually do this with just a heavy attack to the back, body shot. You do need 5 stacks of martyrdom or 3 stacks of thrust in order to get that kill. And that's the list. I hope I didn't make any mistakes in my list here. It is my first attempt after all. I'm sure I made at least one, but in any case, it should be pretty close to true, and you can rely on that much at least. And that will make this a lot easier as you're going to build your Mark 12 and try to figure out how to use it. Obviously, everybody's Mark 12 is going to be a little different, and some of these breakpoints are very tight to get. So if your weapon isn't as good as mine, you may actually have a fairly challenging time hitting a few of these. For example, the berserkers are really hard to nail. Now, you may notice that there are no specialists on this list, and that's because you can very easily one-tap all of the specialists with the heavy attack on this thing. At most, maybe it's 1 stack of thrust for, I think, trappers. Otherwise, should be a shoe-in for an easy kill regardless of other benefits. The mutant is one of the ones I wanted to call out because you can get a spicy 1-tap, but more commonly it's going to be 2 if you're sitting not at 5 stacks of Marty and don't have a bunch of stacks of thrust built up. That kind of thing is really there academically to let you know it can be done. And I often use Rev Attacks on muties as they're charging by anyway, so just FYI. Just to recap, then on our way out the door, you're going to use your heavy attacks against specialists, all types of man-sized elites, and you can even use them against bigger enemies if you're looking to maintain mobility while delivering solid damage. Your heavy rev attacks are going to be your preference for getting solid kills on Reapers, bulwarks, maulers, and crushers, and possibly muties if they're charging by. The light rev attack is a little weird on the Mark 12 because it doesn't have a very strong use case. That's not to say you'll never use it. I certainly use it occasionally to deliver solid damage, then follow up with a light or heavy attack. The push attack rev attack on the Mark 12 is also interesting for the same reasons. Without bloodletter, it doesn't hit any super interesting breakpoints, but it's certainly a good way to deliver a large amount of damage reliably in a mixed group, especially since the thrust is precise. The thrust itself on the push attack does a lot of damage and can be a great way to finish off an enemy quickly if you're looking to get a little extra reach as well. And then the light attacks are used entirely for horde clear, anything from bruisers on down. The light attack follow-up to a rev attack can be good if you miss a breakpoint. A couple light attacks is a good way to get some stagger and damage in to kill whatever it is you're trying to hit, though I will say I tend to use the push attack for that the most because I tend to be surrounded by enemies, and so it's the safest way to secure that single target kill. With that, we have covered all of the key breakpoints, what each swing type is used for, what the weapon itself is used for, and how I recommend you build it. Normally I'd go into tips, tricks, and idiosyncrasies, but to be perfectly honest, I don't have any of those that exceed anything I've already discussed in the Mark IV video. Most of that knowledge ports directly over into this weapon. This weapon is fairly simple with, from my perspective, not a lot of complexity. It doesn't have the deep depths that the Mark IV has to it. That's partially due to the simplified breakpoints, it's partially due to the simplified swing patterns, and lastly, it's probably due in part to the fact that I've already explored the Mark IV to such extreme depths that when I come back to the Mark 12, which is very similar in a lot of base functionality, there isn't much left to say. None of that's to say I don't like the Mark 12. I like to take it up for a spin from time to time. There are definitely reasons to take it. It hits harder than the Mark IV on some key targets, and that can be a lot of fun. And, you know, it gives me a good reason to bring Rev It Up. I'm not saying you want to take Rev It Up on your veteran, but it actually pairs fairly well with Rev It Up if you want to do something like have a sort of slightly slower and slightly stronger Thunderhammer that can get you to the target a lot faster. In that sense, if you wanted to treat this like a Thunderhammer, I suppose you could pair this with a Lawbringer or Flamer or something to help the horde clear weakness you might have. Alright, well I think that about wraps it up. We've explored this weapon as deeply as I've been able to figure out so far, and I am looking forward to the next part of this video, which will be out soon. Essentially, I'm going to do a which is better. I'm going to steal from my buddy Wildspice over there and see which of the 2 chain axes I prefer based on whatever hard data I can pull together. With that, I'll just say thank you all so much for visiting and have yourselves a lovely weekend. Bye-bye!